Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2. So we continue with the discussion of Aristotle's theory, his virtue theory of morality, of right and wrong. And in the second book, Aristotle turns to the analysis of the nature of virtue in relation to habit. And so what we're going to see is Aristotle is going to tie together the rational and the irrational in the development of a full account of what it takes for a human being to become good. And so what's he going to say is that virtue is the result of experience as opposed to nature, or I should say it's not really opposed as a development of our nature. So this follows from a very basic principle established in, or assumption in classical philosophy, classical ethics, that the human being is naturally good. This assumption will be challenged in the 17th and 18th century with the development of Darwinianism, where notions of egoism developed that the human being is not naturally good, but rather naturally self-interested. But it's undecided, I think, at this point, but we can say that, at least within classical thought, the idea is the human being is naturally good. So a virtue is not, we're not naturally virtuous, though. Someone might have a proclivity, for example, to be good at a certain sport, but to become good at a sport or at a certain mathematics or at art, they have to develop it. So virtues are developed over and above our natural inclination to the good. So they are established as types of habits that we develop. So, and look at this, the word ethics is actually Greek in origin, and it comes from the word ethiki, or ethos, meaning a custom or habit. And you can see the close connection there between ethics and virtue ethics, especially as tied to Aristotle's concept of virtue being a type of habit. Now, we have many types of habits out there, right? So if you wash your hands a lot, or often after you go to the bathroom, or before you eat, or before you cook or something, well, that's a habit, right? It's not a virtue, though. You don't say that someone who washes their hands because they wash their hands is a bad person or a good person. I suppose you could sort of use that in relation to children in some way, but as adults, we certainly don't qualify things in that way. So what does that mean? That virtues are types of habits that are beneficial or harmful, and I don't write it here, but you can, what the understood idea is that a virtue is a type of moral habit, right? Because if somebody's courageous or cowardly, you see, this could be something beneficial or harmful to individual or society. Or if someone has an angry temper, or someone is very temperate, in other words, they're controlled, this is something about the quality which relates to our moral qualifications when we say that someone's good or bad. Certainly a coward is something bad, especially something in war that leads to the death of others, you could say, right? So this is virtues, they're moral habits of certain types. So a moral habit, and remember, virtue is an excellence, areti, the Greek word there, so it must be developed, so the habit must be developed to become an excellence, right? Now think of it, a writer doesn't become good at writing just by, getting up one day and writing. Rather, they become good at writing by getting up every day and writing. So the same thing is with a painter. To become a great masterful painter, they have to paint. An athlete, to become a great top player, they have to practice. And a person, to become a virtuous person, has to constantly and consistently do good things. And so that develops the habit of becoming excellent. And the excellence, and remember, this is the idea, is the virtue. The moral excellence is that virtue developed through habit. So tied to this, though, is the notion of a state of character. Okay, so virtue develops through our habit, but also the choices we make, right? Because we have to rationally decide to do something. It brings the rational and the irrational. So we choose to do the good, the right thing, the just thing, right? The noble thing, the courageous thing. And eventually, by continuously choosing that, of course, these choices are built all the way through our youth, and so we kind of grow up into adulthood and find ourselves virtuous, or unfortunately, in some cases, vicious. So we could change our ways, right? But it becomes difficult. We'll talk about that in a second. So eventually virtue becomes the way of doing things. And we then, at that point, when we have a certain way of doing things, we don't really choose anymore. We habitually do so. And again, think of sports. Somebody who's really excellent at a certain sport, hits the goal, hits the target. And you ask them, how do you do that? It's not like they deliberately try every time. Maybe at the beginning they did when they first were playing this sport, but now it's become so natural to them, natural in a derivative or secondary sense, that they developed it. It's become a habit to them, and so they're not choosing anymore, right? So notice the connection here between reason and the irrational. You have to choose and develop the habit, so there's the rational part, but the habit itself eventually takes over and orders your desire in the right direction, so that, you know, when you're faced with a certain circumstance and you have to choose between doing right and wrong, the virtuous person is just going to do the right thing, just like the virtuous athlete is going to get that goal. Okay, so there's an interesting problem that's connected to this, which is that, well, if you're not virtuous, you're vicious, and let's say you recognize that you just make bad decisions, well, unfortunately, you've ordered yourself to this, and it becomes a habit. So what's going to happen is you're going to have to change those habits, and like a swimmer who's swimming against the current of their own habits, it's going to be very difficult. But notice it works well for the virtuous as well, because if you're virtuous, you're habitually ordered to doing right things, so that when the choice to do something wrong comes in the way, it's going to be hard for you to do the wrong thing. And so this is a very interesting theory that Aristotle has, and you can see why it's become so influential. So when you consistently do these things and make the right choices or the wrong choices, you develop a state of your character, and it's your moral character. And the best way to describe it today for our own contemporary terms is it's your moral personality. And a moral personality can have various colors, I like to call them here, which are your particular virtues, and it could be vices as well. So those colors can be that the person is just. You could say, look at John, he always does the fair thing, makes the right decisions. Or look at Jamie, she's very prone to anger. Or look at Mary or Brian, etc., that are moderate, or they're intemperate, or they always do something excessively and they hurt themselves and others. You see? So these become, notice how you're qualifying a character, and you can even say it to the extent, I don't really like John, he's got this anger thing and it scares me, right? It's a vice, right? Or, you can really trust Martha in a situation, even if things become dangerous or fearful, she's courageous and she'll stand up for you, right? So that's the person's characters, the personality. So this is very important, because this means that morality is really tied to what we are as human beings in the sense of our personality. And it makes sense, because when someone does something bad, right, we censor them. When they do something good, we applaud them, and we even punish people who do really bad things, right? So states of character, of moral character, this is tied to our morality as such. Okay, so what's the difference, though, between virtues and vices, right? So someone who's cowardly and someone who's who's courageous, right? Or someone who's prone to anger and someone who restrains themselves, because they're both states of your character, your moral personality. They're both the result of practice, and you can add habits, like they're habits, right? And they result from the choices we consistently make. So what's the difference? Why do we call the one virtuous, courage, and the other vicious? So in the latter sense, right? Vice. Okay, cowardice. So here Aristotle develops his very famous notion of the mean. Okay, and take a look here. So virtue is the mean between extremes. Vice is itself the extremes of excess and deficiency. And this is a very clever analysis of it. So what is virtue? Virtue would be here, the mean, and the excess would be here or there, it doesn't matter, and the deficiency on the other side. So it's on the outskirts, between. So virtue is between these excesses, okay? And here's some excesses and deficiency. Eating too little or too much is an excess or deficiency, right? That's anorexic, or you can become obese, let's say. Exercise in the same way, right? If you eat too much or too little, you become lethargic or you become tired in both cases, right? So how would we analyze that? Well, we can take courage, for example, and we can say that the person who fears too much, there's the excess, will run away and become a coward, right? But then there's the deficiency. What happens if a person doesn't fear enough? For example, there's a war and a soldier just gets up and doesn't listen to the orders of the sergeant, just runs off into the gunfire, right? You could say, well, that person's foolish, right? They're not being courageous there because they don't really understand that this is a terrible situation, that we need to be fearful of it and also should listen to our commander. So the virtuous person in that case would be courageous. Why? Because, well, they recognize the fear, but they don't run from it, right? And at the same time, in recognizing the fear, they know, well, listen, this is fearful, whereas the foolish person, right, the impetuous, they call them, just runs into what's fearful without knowing it. So the virtuous, the courageous person sees the fear and then proceeds onward despite the fear. And this is what makes them courageous, is kind of recognizing and accepting the fear regardless of it. Okay? And so virtue is that mean between extremes, and you can take another virtue, for example, temperance, and temperance is moderating your desire. And the excessive person always goes to excess and has too much, whereas the deficient person is always too austere and never takes enough for themselves, whereas the person who's temperate or even just always takes what's right and never too much or too little, right? And so this is his analysis of the mean and virtue as a mean between extremes, in particular the difference or the distinction between virtue and vice. So a last point here in terms of the mean is that Aristotle says, well, how do you determine the mean? And his answer is that it is relative to us. And so what does he mean? He says, well, it's relative to the individual, the motives, the circumstances, places, and time. Okay, so let's take an example of this. Michael Phelps, you'll know him as the Olympic swimmer who has won multiple medals. Apparently, he eats during his training 12,000 calories a day, right? So notice how you could say that's excessive, but Michael Phelps can say, if I don't eat that, I'm not going to be able to compete, right? Now, if a lazy professor like myself ate that, obviously the consequences would not be good. But Michael Phelps, who eats that, well, the consequences are fine. So for me, it's excessive. For Michael Phelps, it is not. It's actually appropriate. So here we see the understanding of what's relative to us. So taking a moral example, if someone kills another person, you could say, well, this is absolutely wrong that you kill that person. And they could say, well, wait a minute, look at the motive and the circumstances, because this person, I was walking the street, tried to kill me, and I had to defend myself, and so I didn't want to kill them, but I had to, and unfortunately, this was the circumstances I was placed in, right? So we can have a courageous, virtuous person who unfortunately has to do something that doesn't seem right, but in fact, analyzing it makes you see that it is, in fact, the right thing to do. So it's depending upon these circumstances that we determine what's virtuous and what's the mean, and what's excessive and what's deficient and what's in the middle, right? Okay, a further point, and this is important to recognize, that when Aristotle says that virtue and vice are relative to us, he doesn't mean that they're morally relative, that it's in the sense of what's called moral relativism. Now, moral relativism is the view that the morality of an action depends upon personal, cultural, social views. So you can say, well, right and wrong is just what you think is right and wrong, and I think is right and wrong, and nobody knows what's truly right and wrong, right? That's moral relativism, and that is not Aristotle's view. Why? Because Aristotle says that the good is the final cause. I didn't explain that, but that just means the object that we seek, the end that we seek. It's what everyone desires, and it's out there. The good that's out there is not, myself. The good of the flower is not the flower. It's the sunlight. It's the water, etc. The good of the human being, right, are various things that enliven the human being and bring happiness to life, right? And that's beyond the individual and their society, right? And so when Aristotle says relative, he just means that in our ethical theory, in trying to figure out what's the mean, we have to take into account those things that are relative to the particular circumstances, but that doesn't mean that he's espousing this view of moral relativism, which is often espoused today. Okay, so make sure that you keep that in mind and to clearly distinguish Aristotle's views from those of moral relativism, which we will look at later.